Welcome to Creating Smarter Spaces, where we explore the intersection of technology, innovation, and the built environment. Produced for corporate real estate, facilities management, and workplace technology executives like you, this podcast is your go-to resource for staying ahead of the ever-evolving world of smarter spaces. In this episode, we're going to talk about energy and air. Air quality was thrust into the limelight during the pandemic, and thermal comfort in offices has been a topic of much discussion long before that. So given this, I wanted to dedicate this episode to talk to someone about the role technology can play in not only optimizing air quality and temperature in spaces, but also enables you to operate them cost effectively while reducing environmental impacts. It's a win-win. So get ready as I speak with James Palmer, Head of Engineering and Building Sustainability at Metricus. I'm your host, Michael Priscilla, and this is Creating Smarter Spaces. Now let's dig in. James, welcome to Creating Smarter Spaces.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe you can share a little bit about your background and what it is that you spend your day doing for the listeners before we get into it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's very excited to be on. Actually, there is, as you say, that there are a lot of myths and a lot of misunderstanding around this area. So really good opportunity to share some of my 30 odd years of experience in this space. Back in the early 90s, I joined straight a little company called North Building Technologies, a tiny little sort of lifestyle company in Brighton, straight out of uni for me in a tech support role. And what they were doing was building networks of things back before anyone had heard of the Internet of Things. We were making machines talk to machines to improve the efficiency of buildings, really. And this was back when computers talk to computers using RS-232 and RS-485 serial communications that, the dim and distant past, and many of our listeners would never have heard of, and hopefully will never need to come across. But rather antiquated ways of getting machines talking to each other. I didn't even know it was possible to get machines talking to each other when I first joined the business. But that was what we were all about. And there were a couple of entrepreneurs out of one of the big building management system, or building automation system for the US audience companies here in the UK. And the first project that we did was quite interesting. We managed to get the PABX telephone system in a large office block talking to the lighting system, so that you picked up the handset and dialed hash, and then you could use the 2 or the 8 key to turn the lights up and down above your desk. So this much lauded concept of having individual control over your own environment goes back quite a long way. And we actually ended up on TV in the UK on a program called Tomorrow's World with that solution. So it was kind of groundbreaking at the time. And thankfully, it's become more normalised now. And the idea of machines talking to machines in buildings is commonplace. But still, there's no great sort of agreement on what makes a smart building and what makes smart HVAC, and there's no great agreement on what's good to integrate and what can be achieved, and what outcomes people can reasonably expect from investing in this sort of technology. So, it's come a long way in some ways. It's stuck in the past in others, and I think there's a lot of people talk a good talk, but not much that gets delivered. I'd say that's really truly adds proper benefit.
Totally. Well, I'm super excited to have you on the show here today, James. So you are the first official guest on Creating Smarter Spaces. So you're going to take that honor, a badge of honor to take with you for the rest of your career, hopefully. But I did ask you to join today because this is an area that I know enough to be dangerous about, but I know is so much more complex and complicated, right? After COVID, air quality has become, such a big thing for people. And I know, temperature in buildings has always been a thing. And I also think that with the consumerization of everything now, people go to the house and they're so used to being able to, use their Nest thermostat or their Ecobee or whatever they've got and adjust the temperature in the house. And they come to the office and they're like, well, if I can do this at home, I want to be able to do this at the office. And then, as someone who's building or managing one of these spaces, they say, well, we should be able to do that in the office, and are looking for ways to do it. So it's a wish list item for a lot of people, but I know that it's connection between the vision and the execution is something that there seems to be a big divide on.
Yeah, definitely. And the mechanical realities of the building stock that's out there, right? So buildings were never designed in the first place, 10, 20 years ago, when most of the buildings that we live and work in today were built, especially the buildings we work in, were built in the last 40, 50 years. Even fairly recent ones were built with the idea of smart HVAC in place, and so they don't have the mechanical infrastructure to overlay a lot of technology and a lot of smarts onto them. So there's a challenge there with people wanting to make a silk purse from a sow's ear, in many cases. And actually, you got to get your building walking before it can run, and that comes as a bit of a surprise to many landlords when we go in and say, try and understand the building and work out what we can do and what we can realistically deliver. A lot of people have heard really good stories about what can be done with smart buildings, but when you come to actually deliver it into an existing building with all that legacy equipment and the legacy of pipe work and the legacy duct work and the lack of isolation and the lack of valves and the lack of things that you can control to make a space really respond to the way it's being used, is the reality of a lot of real estate there. So yeah, there's not many buildings that are zoned up and mechanically fitted out in a way that you can get really granular control over individual spaces, So
it's a good point. I think you bring up the point there. You talked about the landlord, and a lot of the people that I have in the audience here are from the tenant side of things, right? And so if I'm a tenant and I'm going into a new building, and even if I have a huge budget to spend, and I say, hey, I want to do this in my tenancy. What's some of the challenges around doing that, and how that relates back to the building?
Well, it depends. As a tenant, it depends how in charge you were or are of the fit out of that tenant space. So if you inherited or have moved into a serviced office or a completely fitted out space, then you are reliant on the infrastructure that's there at that point. If you've got the opportunity for a clean slate and you can have individual fan coil units in each modular office, and you can have individual control over localized areas and really zone your floor up or your floors up in a nice logical way and put in on mechanical infrastructure, then you can get to a point where you've got great control over your environment and you can really do something quite powerful and efficient as well. Because what we know these days is that, the buildings aren't used from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. Monday to Friday but they are controlled in that way. BMS, building automation systems, tend to have a time clock on them, and they tend to run the fans and they run the ventilation and heating and cooling on the assumption that the building's full. And that's how they've been designed. And the engineers that installed those systems, often 20, 30 years ago, were trained to turn things on. Right? Their whole career was about making sure, and actually the only way you get paid when you install a BMS system is to prove that things come on, right? So you've got this whole generation of engineers, and really good engineers, who have had it baked into them hardcore to get things running, get the building running, prove that it's running, and at that point you get paid and you can go and do the next building. Right? So, and the way you prove it's running is to turn everything on. So if in doubt, turn it on, right? And we're now coming into buildings saying we want to turn things off. And that's a very different mindset. So
yeah, totally. That's a really interesting point, right? So, when you're there building the building and you're enabling these things or putting them in to start with, you're obviously not doing it in the context of having a building full of people, right? It's an empty space.
No. And the builder, the landlord, the developer is building it to sell the space. They're not invested in what the tenant's going to inherit. They're invested in getting out and getting on to the next job, and doing it at the lowest possible price, because, well, quite often they'll win the contract at minus 10%, and that's genuinely happens. So so large fit out mechanical electrical companies that I've worked with in the past have openly said to me that they take projects at minus 10, 20% margin, and effectively they knock their supply chain to build their margin up. And so they have to do very creative interpretations of specifications. And whoever can get things working for the least amount of cash and get it signed off and meet the spec basically will win the job. So tenants intend to inherit some pretty poor stock. And that's the reality of the built environment that the contractual chain effectively has created, And so where you've got tenants that are, so tenants need empowering really to hold landlords to account for this stuff. It's the landlords that have built these buildings. They're either managing on behalf of a developer or they're owning these buildings. And a lot of the problems that tenants experience are down to the way that buildings are procured and built and the whole contractual chain around that. So, yeah, there's a lot to do, and there's a big cultural change needed.
That's interesting. So, what you're saying is that on the tenant side of things, when you're looking for space, other than just, where the building is and the view that it's got, if they want to do something that is highly personalized and highly customized, like some of this has to come down to the investigation that they do during the site and location search, right?
100%. The discovery work on how that building is serviced. Is there one big air handling unit that provides all the fresh air for the whole building? If there is, then how do you turn your space off when you're not there? And are you getting billed for the supply of that fresh air? And all of those sorts of things, that actually would probably be very low down a list, even if they made the list when people are doing discovery on a new building or a new property. They're really quite impactful nowadays when you've got, especially in mechanically ventilated spaces. This is a big issue. These big glass boxes we build, they need huge, big, sometimes 50, 60 kilowatt fans to run to pump fresh air into the space, and that's huge amounts of energy running constantly. It's an issue.
No, definitely. So that's interesting. It brings up something else I wanted to talk about on this, and this is all around sustainability and cost reduction. That sustainability is on the minds of everybody, but as you just said, it sounds like we've got buildings out there that even if you're taking up a small amount of space or a couple of floors, a lot of the things that are going to be pulling that power aren't really under your control, right? So, if you're a cost conscious or an environmentally conscious tenant, how do you go about trying to balance that in a space like
that? Certainly by measuring and monitoring, so you can learn a lot. You can learn a lot about the space we talked about air quality earlier and the importance of that and the importance of air quality to productivity. So you get those benefits from measuring air quality, but also by measuring air quality, you actually get a really good idea of how your building's being controlled. And it's very easy to then have that data and use it. And we've got real examples of this where the data that we've provided has been used to hold the landlord to account for in some instances, very poor conditions. So very high CO2 in one particular building, which was sorted out via the provision of data. And, you can't argue with the numbers don't lie, right? And also we found that where you find that actually that air seems very cool or very warm at the weekends when there's no one there, and the CO2 levels remain very low at the weekends when no one's there. So we work out that the main plant is running in an empty building, and then all of a sudden, so just some very simple stuff that you can do to hold the landlord to account over what the services that they're providing, and then with your own fit out, making sure it responds to the way the building's being used. Let's not have a BMS that is effectively a time clock. We should be beyond time clocks now, and actually, should we even have them at all? The concept of of a building being open for business, I understand, right? But the desire to preheat or pre-cool a space, pre-cool where you are, preheat where I am, a space before that building is open for business, I totally get. But is that as important as actually making sure the building is only being serviced, heated, cooled, lit, ventilated when it's in use. And actually, these days, I think that's probably should take precedent. And we could all bear a few minutes of discomfort at the beginning of the day if we knew that, that it was being responded to. The building, we've arrived, the building's woken up, and it's going to start taking care of us. And that when we go home that evening, or even that afternoon, or whenever the occupancy levels go low or zero, that the building will stop providing those services, and that the environmental impact. 40% of all CO2 in the world comes from buildings, and we know that HVAC accounts for 30% of all waste. Right, so 30% of all energy spent. Let me be accurate there. 30% of all energy that goes into HVAC is wasted. So there's huge opportunities for saving there, and a lot of the sort of more hair shirt type environmental things that we all do, and I do, and I'm sure you do, because we're conscious people. Sometimes we're hitting the wrong things, right? We're putting our efforts into the wrong areas, and actually there is the lower hanging fruit. So I think making buildings respond to the way they're being used is a really, really easy win, and it's much easier than it sounds. Actually,
It sounds like it, James. I mean, the premise that I know I get asked from an experience perspective in buildings all the time is around, how do we customize space? In the US, I like it at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and somebody else likes it a couple degrees warmer. And how do I pre-cool that office space that an executive's going into because they like it a little bit cooler in there before they get there, and all these types of things. Sounds like nice to haves, but what I hear you saying is that, from an energy perspective, from an environmental perspective, there's a lot more simpler things we could be doing on the macro level to save real money, right? As well as being more environmentally sensitive.
Yeah, absolutely. It's literally money that is being wasted, completely wasted, and they're big numbers. So, with a business case I built up recently for a chain of restaurants in the UK. The savings that we can make just by optimizing their border controls over the next 5 years is £25 million. Right, that's 5 million a year straight on the bottom line without any massive effort. It's not a huge effort, right? It's a small investment from them. So the returns are huge. So even if you forget the environmental impact, I'm not able to. It's something I'm very passionate about. But for people that don't care about the environment, and we know that they exist, the financial impact is a huge argument, and it stands on its own 2 feet without any other considerations. Turn your lights off as well.
Exactly. Well, I'm a big fan of the initiative that Metricus runs every January for Dark January. So definitely like to see that. But going to your point about there being so much money on the table, and I think we're seeing this across the board in commercial real estate as a whole now. At least from what I'm seeing, and from my perspective on this is before COVID, buildings and space and workplaces was just a cost, right? Every organization had it in their head that we were going to spend X hundreds of dollars per employee that we had, and that was going to linearly scale, right? And there wasn't really any executives. The board, the CEO wasn't asking the real estate organization, like, are we really optimized? Could we get away with less? It was like, if we've got 100,000 people, we need X number of square feet, and as long as we've got it, and as long as we don't run out, and no one from the organization is coming to the CEO saying, well, we can't grow because we don't have any space, corporate real estate was getting a green tick. And now, just from a space and occupancy perspective, I think that's getting questioned more in the market around, like, do we have too much? Could we get more efficient? Especially where the economy is right now, could we save more money? And it sounds like, from where you're seeing this, and I'd have to agree from what I'm seeing too, is that it's not just about reducing space. There's also this next dial you can turn, which is, you may have always been spending $5,000, $10,000 a month on your power, but you could potentially cut that by turning some dials.
Yeah, exactly. Those numbers are easier. And understanding your space utilization, again, is something that's easy to do accurately. And we're not talking about doing surveys or badge data. Those sorts of things are very inaccurate. Accurate counting of people in and out will give you a really good picture of how your estate's being used. Working with I won't name them, but a large telecoms company that you've definitely heard of at the moment, they just downsized some offices in the Midlands in the UK here to a smaller out-of-town office. And we've put in some people counting sensors there. Didn't cost them much to roll out the infrastructure. And we found that their new, much smaller, probably a third of the size of their previous office, so they've downscaled. Their new office is only getting about 50% occupancy. So they could have gone way further, right? So even though they've downscaled, but they didn't have the data, they did it on anecdote. So before they moved, they had a sense. They knew they had a lot of empty space, but they did it finger in the air. And we've come in and shown them they could have gone way further and saved a lot more money. So getting that, data-driven decisions are better than decision-based data finding, right? And
totally. No, I think that's something that where people are waking up to. It's becoming more apparent that, hey, we need to know more about what we're doing. I mean, anyone that's listened to my show before or have read any of the stuff that I write know my opinions on badge data and its relevancy and its accuracy. But no, it's definitely something that I think that the industry is still being a little too conservative around. Even if the data tells them to cut 50, still like, well, maybe we'll just cut 20. We want to be safe. We want to make sure we've got enough space. But I think that, well designed and well operated spaces become more active as well, right? There's more things going on. That the offices feel more vibrant if we really get the sizing right and don't leave it with so much vacant space that, as you've just described, we still have to heat and cool.
Exactly. You heat it and cool it in case someone turns up.
Yeah.
And I love that the point you just made there about vibrancy. That I've been in the office 3 days this week. I'm normally in 2 or 3 because I'm a couple of hours away from the office. And that vibrancy thing, we had yesterday afternoon. We've got 2 floors in a building, and there were only a couple of people on the floor I was in. And I said to the guys, let's go upstairs. Let's close this office and migrate upstairs, and the atmosphere immediately picks up. And there's fresh faces and more interaction, and the whole point of being in the office is around that interaction and that vibrancy that you only get when you're all sitting together. If you're all spread out, it's just not the same. I might as well be at home if I'm sat on my own in the corner.
Totally. So hey, I want to pick up another topic that then it's one that's been sort of has bugged me for a while, and I see now there's some changes, and that's the topic of air quality monitoring and when it specifically comes to standards. One of the things that has sort of annoyed me for some period of time is a lot of the standards like LEED and WELL have always looked at air quality, but it's always been this point in time, almost like you said at the start here, of as soon as we build the building, someone walks through with an air quality monitor, say, it's empty, there's nothing in it. They check it and they say, yep, we get the tick and off we go. But I was really excited to see that LEED V5 standard now has, it's not mandatory, which I'd like to see, but has at least now put in extra credits for organizations that are going to consistently monitor air quality. So is this something now that if we do know this in real time, like how does that play into what we can actually do with a smarter implementation of HVAC?
So yeah, I mean it's a bit of a game changer. So the thing I mentioned at the top of the show when we were talking about the contractual chain and people putting in the minimum viable product to get paid and go on to the next job. This is an area that is the first thing that gets value engineered which is when you engineer the value out of a project, in my view, is around CO2 sensors in a BMS installation, right? So the specification will call for CO2 monitoring and fresh air will be controlled by these CO2 sensors. And what happens is the CO2 sensors tend to migrate from having sufficient numbers around the floors to get good readings to one in the return air duct, basically. So you've ticked the box, we've got CO2 sensing, but it's only in the return air duct. And when the return air fan isn't running, you don't know what the CO2 levels are in the space. You're just reading the duct. So you never get a good reading, and the plant becomes very inefficient. So you're never quite in control of air quality in the way you should be without proper air quality sensors. We're also, there are issues around the speed of installation, get it working, turn it on, and move on, compared to actually properly calibrating really good quality sensors, and the sort of sensors that you and I would go and install into buildings and recommend to people, and the effort that we would put into making sure they work properly and are accurate. So taking that accurate data and making it available to the building automation system is actually really quite easy now with the Internet of Things and APIs and all the sort of the work I do day to day for Metricus is about taking the occupancy levels, the indoor air quality levels, and sharing that data with the building's control system. So not so that we can change the BMS, we don't touch that. So the incumbent on site can reprogram their controllers to respond to all this nice new data that we can provide. And also, very important, we talk about indoor air quality, it's very important you also measure the outdoor air quality, because the amount of pollutants that in buildings typically come in from the outside, traffic, tyres, road noise, all of those sorts of things that come in. So if you don't know, you could well increase pollution by pulling in fresh air from outside. So very important to measure the outside air before you start pumping it into the building. Something always overlooked.
That's a really good point. I know that we've seen definitely post-COVID, right? I think everybody acknowledges that organizations are more conscious about air and especially air quality. But I think that's come down because employees and us as consumers are more conscious of it. But interesting point, you talked about outside air quality. I know that just from what I've seen anecdotally, this has also become a big thing in the United States, especially in the Northeast after the last couple of years of the big wildfires, and people being concerned about the outdoor air quality in places like New York, generally being average, but when the wildfires kick off, it's horrible. And then, as you just said, we're sucking that air into a space that's probably better than outside, right? And so balancing those two things is obviously quite a challenge.
And you've got the extremes of temperature as well. So these are things that often aren't considered. So midwinter, you mentioned New York. So midwinter in New York, when it's minus 20 outside and horrifically cold, and then in the middle of summer, it's 100 degrees outside. And then you've got a little air handling unit providing fresh air with a heater battery and a cooling battery in it. And that, so to provide fresh air to the whole building, that there's normally not enough heating power in the air handling unit to take full fresh air at minus 20 degrees and get it warm enough to pump around the building. So you recirculate air. And when you recirculate, you just spread the germs and the air quality gets slowly worse. So what you want to do is use as much fresh air as possible, assuming the air is fresh. You want as much of that as possible for a nice, productive work environment. But at the extremes of temperature for a few weeks of the year in the winter and a few weeks in the summer, the systems you've got can't. They just physically can't do that. So here comes another angle of understanding what spaces are occupied, and what your occupancy levels are. What if you could close off 3 or 4 floors of your space and focus all the energy of that little heating unit on the 2 or 3 floors you've got occupied? Actually, maybe you could run full fresh air or a lot more fresh air into the building with your existing infrastructure. So you get to really, utilize the systems you've got in place rather than having to add extra heating, add extra cooling, and to cope with the increased demand on the fresh air supply. So occupancy levels are really key on that.
That's really interesting because I'm assuming from a cost and sustainability and power consumption perspective that every time you're heating or cooling, you're using even more energy, right? Just on that, other than just blowing the air in, we're burning power to heat or cool.
Exactly. So that's why recirculating air is a very efficient way of keeping heating and cooling spaces. When you get in your car, and it's hot outside, you put that reset button and the air conditioning on to get the temperature down, and then it gets stuffy and you turn it off because you want some fresh air in. it's the same in a building. It's exactly the same type of equipment, just on a bigger scale, and the same issues that you hit. So being able to sort of get granular control over the space, and this is this mechanical infrastructure thing, being able to mechanically isolate a floor and electrically isolate a floor is a really powerful thing. We can then turn floors off. Friday afternoons, we could say the top half of the building is off, right? And as much as you like sitting on floor 66, it's not open today. You're on floor 61 because the top half of Manhattan, the space in One Manhattan West is off, because we know that there's not enough people in the space to justify servicing all those areas.
Interesting. Yeah. And I suppose that, I've had another episode here where I talked about gamification on the last episode. From those types of scenarios, right, when we've got this information, we've got this data, we can feed that back to employees as well and show them, hey, we're saving this much energy. This might be a slight inconvenience for you, but let's show you what we're actually saving, right? There's a financial saving, there's an environmental saving, there's a power consumption saving by us doing this. And, in those scenarios, it offsets the discomfort, or maybe it's not discomfort, but just annoyance of, hey, I've got to go to a different floor.
You're absolutely right. One of the best things we ever did on this is in a previous role, a previous project, for a company called Speedy Hire in the UK. So they're a company where if you want to hire a digger or a forklift truck or something like that, that's where you go. So they're big out of town shed type units. You can imagine huge roller shutter doors and huge gas fired heaters in the ceiling. And we put in a system, really simple IoT system, where if the roller shutter doors were open, the heating goes off. You can't heat the whole world. It's pointless having it on. Really simple thing. This caused loads of complaints. And then we found that sensors were going missing from walls and stuff. And so we just had up some laminated signs put up around the space explaining this with an arrow. This sensor is controlling the heater. These sensors on the roller shutter door turn the heaters off when the door's open, because you're not benefiting from the heat. And the complaints stopped immediately, and it was that thing of educating the user to understand why. And as soon as they understood why, there was no complaint. They bought into it completely. It was a game changer for them. And they rolled out to their whole estate across the UK. Saved them a fortune. Literally saved fortunes. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like these things are just such low-hanging fruit that have probably been literally hanging in front of most people's faces for a long time, and we haven't realized it. So I wanted to touch on one other thing also here, because I know it's one of those, maybe I call it a myth, me being able to decide that I want my room hot, and then you're sitting in a room next to me deciding that you want the room cold, and I pull out my app and I say, hey, I want to turn up the temperature in my room. Or even if I'm pushing I think the thing that most people have seen, even in the more basic spaces, they walk into a room, there's a thermostat on the wall, and they say, hey, I want it hotter, and they push the dial up, and there's somebody sitting on the other side of the wall saying, hey, I want it colder. Like, what's actually happening in the building when that happens? And are we heating and cooling these spaces at the same time, or what's the reality?
There's a small percentage of buildings out there that have the mechanical infrastructure for you to be able to have, for us to have meeting rooms next to each other or offices next to each other. And I'm at 18 degrees and you're at 24, right? It's possible in some buildings to do that. For the majority of buildings, it's not possible. It's certainly not efficient. Right, so it is the idea that people are just going to roll this technology out to all of these buildings and magically achieve the impossible is for most part nonsense. And frankly, when I hear people talking about it like that, my first thought is, you haven't been in enough buildings, right, trying to deliver smarts to understand how impossible this is and how unrealistic what you're saying is in the real world. Quite often you'll have, I'm just thinking about the last building I surveyed quite recently, which has air handling units on the roof to bring fresh air in, and they have heating. Yeah, they have heating for the winter, and then on each floor there's an air handling unit which takes the tempered air from the big one on the roof and provides it to the floor, right? And that's got a heating and a cooling battery in it. So the floor either gets heated air or cooled air. That's it. The whole floor.
Yeah.
And
because I'm assuming it's blowing it through the same
it's all coming
ductwork,
through the
right,
same
across
ductwork
the
from the
building.
same effectively what we call an air conditioning unit. It either provides hot air or it provides cool air. So what I could do potentially is close, if I wanted it cooler and the building's in heating mode, I could close the vent to my office and I wouldn't get fresh air. So I'd just get high CO2 and I wouldn't get the hot air coming in. The reality of the way that buildings are built just doesn't lend itself to that level of granular control. And when you come to open plan spaces, you define the laws of physics. Then there's no way of isolating or controlling something desk by desk or zone by zone. Even it's just not realistic. The thermostat wars are a good one. The old trick, and this is I've seen this done for real, is to put a thermostat on the wall that's not connected to anything, and the complaints stop immediately because everyone believes I was cold, I've gone and turned the heating up, and they go and sit back down and don't think about it again for the rest of the day, and it works. It works. Yeah. And if the buildings sort of between 19 and 23 degrees, is there much more you can really do? Honestly, that's a fairly comfortable level, and you've got to manage that. You want it a bit. Conversely, you probably want it a bit cooler in the winter and allow it to get a bit warmer in the summer. The thermal shock from when you come in from a cold space into the hot air of a hot building, you want to minimise that so people don't feel so uncomfortable. So allowing the building to flow a bit with the outside air not only reduces the load on all the plants, so they're working less, so the building's more efficient. It actually feels more comfortable to you. You've come to work in a big jumper because it's cold outside, and now we've got the building at 24 degrees, and you're like, oh my god, So all the
Reminds me of some of my experience of walking into the London Underground in the middle of winter.
Any time of year, midsummer in the London Underground is horrendous, utterly horrendous.
So I think one thing that I've seen, because obviously there's topics of discussion out there about different types of people, like different types of set points and different types of average temperatures. I think one of the things when we start talking about smarter spaces and we start talking about putting IoT devices out there that I've seen successful, maybe along the lines of yours with the dummy thermostats, is organizations making temperature data transparent across the floor plate, right? Whether it be in an app or through a website. And then if I am somebody who enjoys warmer space, I know that this side of the building is always going to be 1 or 2 degrees warmer than the other one, just from the way the sun comes in, or maybe some inefficiencies even in the way that the HVAC system was implemented in the first place, right? This corner is always a little bit hotter than the other one.
And being able to heat map, on a floor plan and just see that heat map and understand that, and then maybe display that on some digital signage in the lift lobby, perhaps. People will understand. Well, actually, I'll go and sit over there. What a great idea! I'm going to sit in that south window this morning and feel a bit warmer because I'm cold. And so, the way that people hot desk and the way that building spaces are used these days gives us that freedom. So it makes a lot of sense to share that data. There is resistance to that in some corners because some people will know that they don't have enough control over their space and they just open themselves up to complaints. So that's where you get a bit of resistance. But overall, I think that's generally a good idea. Being able to show CO2 levels in offices, in meeting rooms as well, is a really key thing. The productivity and CO2 level, this very well, that they're so heavily related. And we've all sat in meeting rooms and felt sleepy. We've all felt it. It's hard to stay engaged when that CO2 level goes too high. So it comes back to, again, right sizing, making sure that the fresh air plant isn't having to work too hard. So it's not servicing the whole building, it's servicing the spaces that are occupied, and then allowing it to do the air changes that you need to keep everyone productive while they're working.
Awesome. So James, I got one last question for you before we wrap it up here. So, if you're listening to to this episode with us right now, and you're about to embark on a new build or a major renovation project, what are two or three of the key things that you would say to people when you're designing your
Yeah.
space, when you're working with your architect or your HVAC people, like what are the easy things that they can do to help them be better?
Well, more is less, right? So more control, more granular control, more dampers to allow you to isolate spaces, more heating and recooling and cooling batteries out on the floors to give you more granular control, and more air handling units and more power. So it feels like you're putting a lot of things of power hungry devices into a space, and that feels like you're going to spend more money on energy. But actually, what you get is more granular control of the space. So it means you can isolate areas and turn them off. And so the spaces that are occupied become better spaces to be in, and the spaces that aren't occupied don't cost you money to run. So, but that consideration at fit out time is really key. So giving yourself the power to isolate and turn areas off is really, really important. And that's where you'll get the big savings. And like I say, it will improve the spaces that are occupied massively because the power you've got can be focused on those areas. So I think that's really, really important. And make sure that the building is tuned. So mechanical ventilation, I can't remember the exact numbers, but there's so many cubic feet of fresh air per person per square foot that you have to put into a building to meet regs. Now, but because most building automation systems don't know how many people are in a space, when they design, they have to assume maximum occupancy. So it's like 10 people meeting room. We have to put 10 people's worth of fresh air into that space. Design the building so that the building responds to the way it's being used. Count the people in and out of spaces and use that value live straight back into the building automation system. So the building is constantly responding to the way it's being used. That fan, that big, there might be a 15 kilowatt fan running. If it's only running at a quarter of the pace that it needs, a quarter of full speed, because there's only a quarter of the number of the people in that space, the savings are huge and they're relentless. It just goes on and on and on, Cost of ownership is huge. So, yeah, more is less. But it does require a bit of front loading. It requires a bit of bravery to spend more at the front, to save in the long run. The more kit you put in, the more we can control, the more we can turn off.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. I think that we see this across the board with everything to do with technology and real estate right now. Is I feel like a lot of people are afraid to go first. Yeah. We hear about the theory behind it, but everyone is sort of sitting around looking at everyone else saying, well, have you done this? And are the savings real? And is this just theoretical? Is it a spreadsheet activity? I've encouraged, people listening to this show many times to, be bold, be the people that go first. Mm-hmm. The people that choose to listen to the show are those types of people, to be able to make the decision to try something new. Do it on a floor, do it on a small building to start with, right? You don't have to go and do it in your flagship space. Prove out those savings are there, and then use that to build the business case to go back and say, hey, look, we know we can cut down 20%, 30%, who knows, even more of cost. Here's the numbers. Here's the spreadsheet. It justifies the implementation on a purely financial basis, right? Like, and as you said, like, even we're all, I know you and I see the world in a similar way when it comes to environment, but this makes sense on the financial level.
And these are businesses, right? So what's their... They're there to make money, so don't throw it away.
Totally. I think the opportunity is huge. All right, well, James, we're going to wrap it up today. If people want to get in touch with you, geek out about buildings, work out how to make their spaces more efficient, what's the best place for them to find you, and how can they get in touch?
I'm on LinkedIn, James Palmer at Metricus, and it's jp at metricus.io. If you want us, and Metricus has got a K in it, not a C.
Wonderful. Well, James, look, hey, I want to thank you for coming on today. I know I've learned a lot more about this topic. As I said, I came into this knowing enough to kind of be dangerous, and maybe I know enough to be a little bit more dangerous now. But it's a super fascinating area for me. Definitely one that, as you said, it's probably some of the first tech that ever went into buildings.
Yeah.
Right? It's been there for a long time. And there's so much new technology out there that we can marry up with even some of the older systems. But if we're really starting to build a new building, we're starting a renovation, we want to get efficient, we want to save money, we want to do the right thing for our people, we want to do the right thing for the environment. I think what the takeaway for me from this episode is it's really worth spending that extra time to double click into what's in the building, how the building operates, and then really think about the investment that you're putting in as a tenant as well to be able to capitalize on the functionality that you're getting at the landlord level.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So that's a wrap on today's episode. But before we leave today, just a reminder, I make this podcast for you. So if it's something you like and feel others would too, please consider leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice or share it with a colleague or friend. Not sure how to? Not a problem. Just point them to smarterspaces.live/listen and all the options will be available right there. As always, one final disclaimer, all views and opinions I share on this podcast are my own and may not necessarily be those of my employer. I trust you've enjoyed today's topic and I hope you'll tune in for another episode soon. This is where real estate, facilities management, and technology converge. This is creating smarter spaces.